The stale air of the Redemption Saloon hung thick with the ghosts of cheap whiskey and shattered dreams. A miasma of desperation that clung to the rough-hewn wooden walls like a shroud. It was a place where hope came to die, and humanity was often the cheapest commodity. On this scorching afternoon, the commodity was a young woman, her spirit held captive within a frame too fragile for the weight of the world's cruelty. Her name, though no one in that den of vipers cared to ask, was Lyra. Her skin, the color of rich earth kissed by the prairie sun, was the excuse for her degradation, the visible marker that, in the eyes of these men, stripped her of her personhood and rendered her an object to be bartered. She stood on a rickety crate, her chin held high, though a tremor ran through her limbs like an aspen in a storm. Her eyes, dark pools reflecting a silent scream, darted from one leering face to another, each one a caricature of greed and casual malice. Jedediah Slane, the saloon owner, a man whose heart was as shriveled as his soul, gestured towards her with a flourish, his voice a gravelly rasp that scraped at the raw edges of decency. "Gentlemen, a rare bloom from the wilderness, unbroken, spirited. What am I bid for this exotic treasure?" His words were daggers, each one piercing the fragile armor of her composure. A ripple of crude laughter and muttered obscenities answered him. Lyra flinched, her hands clenching into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. She had been stolen from her people, passed from one callous hand to another, each exchange chipping away at her belief in goodness. Yet a spark of defiance still flickered within her, a refusal to be extinguished. Reader, have you ever witnessed a moment where the very air crackled with injustice, a moment that cried out for a hero, even when none seemed forthcoming? Such was this moment, pregnant with despair. The scales of fate tipped precariously towards ruin. The bidding began, a grotesque parody of commerce. Men haggling over a human soul as if she were a side of beef or a new saddle. The price was insultingly low, a testament to their contempt. Lyra closed her eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a burning path down her cheek. Just as Slane was about to bring his grimy gavel, a whiskey bottle down to seal her fate to a particularly odious trapper whose breath reeked of carrion, the saloon doors swung inward. A figure stood silhouetted against the blinding glare of the afternoon sun, a tall man, broad-shouldered, his presence radiating a quiet authority that instantly dampened the raucous atmosphere. He moved with an unhurried grace, his worn leather duster swirling around his boots as he stepped into the dim interior. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was etched with lines that spoke of hardship and introspection, but his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. This was Elias Thorne, a rancher from the high plains, a man of few words and even fewer social calls to places like the Redemption Saloon. He was known for his vast herds, his unyielding integrity, and a sorrow he carried deep within him, the loss of his wife years ago having carved a hollowness that no amount of success could fill. He had come to town for supplies, a rare journey, and had only stepped into the saloon seeking the freight master, not this spectacle of human degradation. His gaze swept over the scene, lingering for a fraction of a second on Lyra, and something in her defiant stance, her silent plea for dignity amidst the squalor, resonated with a chord deep within his own solitary heart. The bidding had stalled, the men momentarily distracted by the newcomer. Slane, annoyed by the interruption, barked, "Well, Thorne, didn't expect to see you gracing my establishment. Come for a drink, or just to cast judgment on us sinners?" Elias ignored him, his eyes, cold as a winter wind, fixed on the trapper who was reaching a possessive hand towards Lyra. Then, without a word, Elias Thorne strode to the bar. He reached into his duster and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. With a resonant thud that cut through the sudden silence, he slammed a gold coin onto the scard, with a coin so substantial it made the trapper's entire bid look like pocket change. The sound echoed the finality of a judge's gavel, but this was a judgment of a different kind. Every eye in the saloon was now on Elias, then on the gleaming gold. Slane's jaw dropped. "Thorne, that's more than enough to buy the whole damn saloon, never mind the girl." Elias finally spoke, his voice low, but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "She's not for sale like cattle." His eyes met Lyra's, and for the first time, she saw not contempt or avarice, but something unreadable, perhaps even respect. He turned his gaze back to Slane, the steel in his eyes daring any to challenge him. "She comes with me." The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the buzzing of a trapped fly against a dirty windowpane. The trapper scowled but visibly deflated under Elias's unwavering stare. Slane, ever the opportunist, quickly pocketed the coin, his greed overcoming any other sentiment. "Sold, to Mr. Thorne, a man of taste and decisive action," he declared with false bonhomie, eager to defuse the tension and legitimize the transaction he hadn't controlled. Elias simply nodded, then walked towards the crate. He didn't offer a hand, didn't utter a soft word, but his presence was a shield. He waited, allowing Lyra to make her own move. Trembling, she slowly stepped down, her legs unsteady. She looked up at this silent, imposing man, her fear warring with a nascent flicker of something she hadn't felt in an eternity. A fragile, almost unbelievable sliver of hope. He had bought her, yes, but his words, "She's not for sale like cattle," echoed in her mind. What did it mean? Was this just another form of ownership or something else entirely? The answer, she knew, lay beyond the swinging doors of the Redemption Saloon, out in the vast, unforgiving land under the silent watch of this stranger. The journey from the stench of the Redemption Saloon to Elias Thorne's ranch was a passage through a landscape of raw, untamed beauty, mirroring the turmoil in Lyra's own heart. Dust devils danced across the parched earth, spiraling towards a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. Elias rode his sturdy gelding with an easy familiarity, his silence as vast as the plains themselves. Lyra followed on a sway-backed mare he'd procured from the livery, her own mount having been stolen long ago. She expected orders, harsh words, perhaps even blows, the bitter currency of her recent life. Instead, there was only the rhythmic creak of saddle leather, the soft thud of hooves on the trail, and Elias's imposing, yet strangely unthreatening back. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since leaving the saloon. When the sun beat down with merciless intensity, he'd silently passed her his canteen, its cool water a balm to her parched throat. Later, as the afternoon shadows lengthened and a chill crept into the air, he'd unstrapped a thick wool blanket from his saddle roll and, without looking at her, simply held it out. She took it, her fingers brushing his calloused hand, a fleeting contact that sent a shiver of surprise, not fear, through her. It was the first human touch in longer than she could recall that wasn't meant to harm or degrade. The land grew more rugged, rising into foothills dotted with resilient pines and stubborn oaks. After what felt like an eternity, they crested a ridge, and below them, nestled in a wide, fertile valley carved by a meandering river, lay the Thorne Ranch. It was no mere homestead. It was an empire built of sweat and determination. A sprawling, sturdy ranch house, built of timber and stone, stood at its heart, smoke curling invitingly from its chimney. Barns, corrals, and outbuildings were laid out with a sense of order and permanence. Fences, strong and well-maintained, stretched as far as the eye could see, enclosing pastures where hundreds of cattle grazed peacefully. It was a place of substance, of deep roots, a world away from the transient cruelty she had known. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, yet there was a profound stillness, a sense of sanctuary that resonated deep within her. As they rode into the main yard, a woman emerged from the ranch house, wiping her hands on an apron. She was older, her face a roadmap of kindness and resilience, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. This was Martha, Elias's housekeeper and confidant for over 20 years, a woman whose loyalty was as steadfast as the mountains that framed the valley. Martha's warm smile faltered slightly as she took in Lyra, her torn dress, the haunted look in her eyes, the undeniable fact that she was a stranger, and a woman Elias had brought home unannounced. Elias dismounted, his movements economical and precise. "Martha," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority it had in the saloon. This is Lyra. She'll be staying just like that.
No explanación, no preamble.
Lyra tensed, expecting judgment, suspicion. Martha's gaze softened as she truly looked at Lyra, not at her dishevelment, but into her eyes, seeing the fear and the flicker of a trapped spirit. She saw the shadows of suffering there, shadows she recognized from her own long life. Her gaze then shifted to Elias, a silent question in her eyes. He met her look, and an understanding passed between them, one forged over years of shared griefs and quiet triumphs. Martha nodded slowly. "Welcome to the Broken Tea, Lyra," she said, her voice gentle, like a soothing balm. "You look like you could use a hot meal and a soft bed." She didn't press for details, didn't pry. Her acceptance was immediate, unconditional, a lifeline thrown to a drowning soul. Elias merely grunted, a sound that Martha interpreted as satisfaction, and led the horses towards the barn. Lyra remained standing by the mare, feeling small and exposed in the vastness of the yard. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking spectacle that seemed to mock her inner darkness. Martha approached her. "Come on, child. Let's get you inside." Her hand, warm and surprisingly strong, rested briefly on Lyra's arm. Again, that unexpected gentleness. Inside, the ranch house was spacious and clean, filled with the aroma of baking bread and stewing meat. Polished wood gleamed in the lamplight, and a fire crackled merrily in the large stone hearth. It was a home, a true home, radiating a warmth Lyra had only dreamed of. Martha led her to a small, neat room under the eaves. It had a comfortable-looking bed with a patchwork quilt, a simple washstand, and a window that looked out onto the moonlit valley. "This will be yours," Martha said softly. "No one will bother you here. Rest now. We can talk in the morning if you feel up to it." She placed a clean nightgown, soft from many washings, on the bed. Lyra could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears. Left alone, she sank onto the edge of the bed, the unfamiliar softness a stark contrast to the hard floors and straw pallets of her recent past. She looked around the room at the simple, honest furnishings. Was this another gilded cage? A more comfortable prison? Or could it be something else? The silence of the house was profound, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the sigh of the wind in the eaves. She was safe for now. But safety was a foreign concept, a fragile illusion she dared not trust. The exhaustion of weeks, months, of constant fear finally washed over her, and she lay down, pulling the quilt up to her chin, her mind a whirlwind of questions, her heart a fragile thing, caught between the terror of the known and the terrifying uncertainty of the unknown. Was this silent rancher her savior, or just a different kind of master? The answer, she knew, would unfold with the dawn. The first days at the Broken Tea Ranch were a blur of uneasy adjustments for Lyra. She woke each morning with a jolt of panic, the ingrained terror of her past life clinging to her like a stubborn burr, expecting a harsh command or a rough hand. But each dawn brought only the quiet sounds of the ranch waking, the distant clatter of milk pails, the soft nicker of horses, the murmur of Martha's voice in the kitchen downstairs. Martha was a constant, gentle presence. She didn't pry or coddle, but simply included Lyra in the rhythms of the household. "There's fresh coffee on the stove, dear, when you're ready," she'd say with a warm smile, or, "Could you give me a hand shelling these peas?" Many hands make light work. Lyra moved through these initial days like a phantom, silent and watchful, her senses on high alert for any sign of threat. She ate the wholesome food Martha prepared, her appetite slowly returning, but her words were few, her eyes still clouded with suspicion. She flinched if anyone moved too suddenly near her, recoiled from even the most casual touch. Elias Thorne remained an enigma. He was a man of the land, rising before dawn and returning after dusk, his days filled with the endless work of managing his vast domain. He rarely spoke to Lyra directly, and when he did, his words were brief, practical, usually related to some aspect of the ranch. "The pump handle needs easing," or "mind the black stallion, he's got a temper yet." She felt his gaze on her sometimes, When he thought she wasn't looking, a searching, contemplative look that wasn't unkind, but deeply unsettling in its intensity. He gave her space, an almost unnerving amount of it. There were no demands, no expectations laid upon her, beyond the simple courtesy of sharing their roof. This absence of coercion was more disorienting than outright cruelty. It left her adrift, without the familiar anchors of fear and subservience. To combat the suffocating sense of uselessness, and to keep her mind from dwelling on the horrors she'd endured, Lyra began to seek out small tasks. She started by helping Martha in the kitchen, her movements initially clumsy, then gradually more assured as she relearned forgotten domestic skills. She swept the wide plank floors of the ranch house, her strokes tentative at first, then firmer, as if sweeping away the shadows of her past. She found a strange solace in the rhythmic, repetitive nature of the work. One afternoon, Martha found her in the small herb garden behind the kitchen, her brow furrowed in concentration as she carefully weeded around a clump of struggling rosemary. "My mother taught me about herbs," Lyra said, her voice barely a whisper, the first unsolicited piece of information she had offered about herself. Martha smiled gently. "They have their own wisdom, don't they? Just like people. Some need a bit more tending to thrive." Lyra nodded, her fingers tracing the feathery leaves of a lavender plant. It was a small moment, but it felt significant, a tiny crack in the wall of silence she had built around herself. Despite these tentative steps, the nights were often the hardest. Sleep offered no escape, only a canvas for her nightmares. One evening, unable to bear the confines of her room, she slipped out of the house and wandered towards the corrals, the cool night air a welcome relief. The moon cast long, eerie shadows, and the familiar scent of horses and hay brought a strange comfort. She leaned against the sturdy wooden fence, gazing at the dark shapes of the horses moving restlessly within. Suddenly, a memory, sharp and brutal, pierced through her, the leering face of a man who had owned her for a cruel winter, his laughter as he'd struck her for some imagined slight. A choked sob escaped her, and she pressed her forehead against the rough wood, tears streaming down her face, the carefully constructed dam of her composure finally breaking. She wept silently, for her lost family, her stolen innocence, for the dignity that had been systematically stripped from her. She didn't hear Elias approach, his footsteps muffled by the soft earth. He had been checking on a restless colt and saw her solitary figure by the corral. He stopped a short distance away, his instinct to retreat warring with a new, unfamiliar urge to offer something. He wasn't a man comfortable with tears, with overt displays of emotion. His own grief was a silent, deeply buried thing. He stood there for a long moment, watching her shoulders shake, his heart aching with a shared understanding of pain. He knew what it was to lose, to feel a wound so deep it seemed it would never heal. Finally, he took a tentative step forward. Lyra stiffened, whirling around, her eyes wide with alarm, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle her sobs. She looked like a startled deer, poised for flight. Elias stopped, holding up a hand, palm out, a gesture of peace. "Just checking the stock," he said, his voice rougher than usual. He didn't approach further, didn't comment on her tears. He simply stood there, a silent sentinel in the moonlight. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he spoke again, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "The nights can be long out here." It wasn't much, but it wasn't a dismissal either. It was an acknowledgement, perhaps, of her sorrow, of the loneliness that could echo in the vast emptiness of the plains. Lyra slowly lowered her hand, her breathing still ragged. She didn't speak, but she didn't run. They stood there in the cool darkness, two solitary souls, surrounded by the sleeping ranch, a fragile, unspoken truce hanging in the air between them. The encounter left Lyra shaken, but also strangely lighter. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and he hadn't recoiled, hadn't exploited her weakness. Perhaps, just perhaps, this silent, stoic man was different. The question still lingered, a persistent whisper in the quiet corners of her mind. Was this sanctuary real, or just a more elaborate trap? The stark encounter by the corrals, where Elias had witnessed Lyra's raw grief and offered not judgment but a quiet, shared stillness, became an almost imperceptible turning point. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but rather like the first thawing of a frozen river, a subtle loosening of the ice that had encased Lyra's heart. Elias, true to his nature, didn't mention the incident. His demeanor remained largely unchanged, reserved, observant, a man more comfortable with the language of the land and his animals than with complex human emotions. Yet, Lyra began to notice small things. When he spoke to her now, it was less about the mechanics of the ranch and more often a shared observation, a quiet comment that invited, rather than demanded, a response. One morning, as she was tending the struggling rosebush near the porch, a plant his late wife, Sarah, had cherished, Elias paused on his way to the stables. He watched her for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration as she carefully loosened the soil around its roots. Sarah always said that one needed a gentle hand, he murmured, his voice softer than Lyra had ever heard it. It was the first time he'd mentioned his deceased wife in her presence. Lyra looked up, surprised. "It looks like it's been through a hard winter," she replied, her voice still hesitant. "But the roots are strong." Elias nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, sorrow, perhaps, or a distant memory. "Most things worth keeping are," he said, more to himself than to her, before continuing on his way. The exchange was brief, yet it resonated with Lyra. He had shared a piece of his past, a small vulnerability, and in doing so had acknowledged her presence in a new way. Slowly, Lyra found her voice. It began with simple responses to Martha's cheerful chatter, then tentative questions about the ranch, about the unfamiliar plants and animals. Martha, ever patient, answered her questions with warmth and a wealth of practical knowledge. She taught Lyra how to bake bread in the big stone oven, how to mend torn denim with neat, strong stitches, how to identify the medicinal herbs that grew wild in the valley. These shared tasks became a quiet classroom, a space where Lyra could reclaim a sense of competence and purpose. One afternoon, while helping Martha sort through a basket of newly harvested apples, Lyra spoke her first full, unsolicited sentence to her. "My grandmother used to make apple preserves," she said, a wistful note in her voice. "With cinnamon and wild honey." Martha's eyes lit up. "Did she now? Perhaps you could show me how one day. I've always found my preserves a bit lacking." Lyra felt a flush of shy pleasure. The idea of teaching Martha something, of having a skill to offer, was a novel and empowering sensation. The ranch itself began to feel less like a place of confinement and more like a sanctuary. The vast, open spaces that had initially intimidated her now offered a sense of freedom. She would often walk along the riverbank in the late afternoons, watching the water flow, feeling the sun on her face. The land was harsh, unforgiving in its own way, but it was also honest, its beauty raw and undeniable. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't, unlike the smiling, treacherous faces of the men in the towns she'd passed through. She discovered a quiet affinity with the animals. The horses, initially wary of her, began to accept her presence. There was one particularly timid filly in the far pasture that shied away from everyone, even Elias. Lyra started visiting her, speaking softly, offering handfuls of sweet grass. Slowly, painstakingly, she earned the filly's trust, until one day, the little horse allowed Lyra to stroke her velvety nose. Elias watched this from a distance, unobserved, a rare smile touching his lips. He saw in her patience, in her gentle persistence, a reflection of the resilience he was beginning to admire. He also saw a quiet strength, a core of goodness that all her suffering had failed to extinguish. The change in Elias was subtle, but Martha noticed it. The lines of sorrow around his eyes seemed a little softer, the set of his jaw less grim. He even began to linger a little longer at the dinner table, listening to Martha and Lyra's quiet conversation, occasionally interjecting a dry comment that, to Lyra's surprise, sometimes held a hint of wry humor. One evening, a fierce thunderstorm rolled through the valley, the kind that rattled the very foundations of the house. Lyra, despite her growing sense of security, found herself trembling, the roar of the thunder bringing back terrifying memories of being trapped, helpless. Martha, sensing her distress, came and sat with her in the dim light of the kitchen, telling stories of her own childhood on the prairie, her calm voice a soothing anchor in the storm. Elias, who had been out checking the livestock, returned soaked to the bone. He saw Lyra's pale face, the tremor in her hands. He didn't say anything, but he built up the fire in the hearth, its warmth and light pushing back the shadows and the fear. Later, when the storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth, Lyra found a small, intricately carved wooden bird on her windowsill. It was simple, unadorned, but clearly made with care. She knew, without asking, that Elias had carved it. It was a silent offering, a gesture of kindness that spoke volumes. She clutched it tightly, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. The seeds of trust, planted in the barren soil of her fear, were beginning to sprout, fragile yet tenacious. But even as this delicate bloom of hope began to unfurl, a shadow lingered on the horizon. News from travelers passing through the area sometimes reached the isolated ranch. One day, a cattle drover, stopping for water, mentioned in passing that he'd heard talk in the town of Redemption. Jedediah Slane, the saloon owner, had apparently been grumbling loudly about being cheated out of a valuable asset by a high and mighty rancher. He'd been asking questions, describing a woman with Lyra's distinctive appearance. Martha, who overheard the drover's casual remarks, felt a chill despite the warmth of the day. She caught Elias's eye, a silent warning passing between them. The fragile piece of the broken tea felt suddenly threatened, the sanctuary vulnerable. Was their haven strong enough to withstand the coming storm? The news from the drover, though casually delivered, hung in the air of the broken tea like the calm before a tempest. Jedediah Slane's inquiries were a clear signal. The past was not content to remain buried. Elias Thorne, a man who faced threats with stoic resolve rather than panic, processed the information with grim pragmatism. He knew men like Slane greedy, opportunistic, and possessed of a festering resentment when their perceived authority was challenged. Slane wouldn't easily forget the public humiliation of being outbid and implicitly condemned in his own saloon. Lyra, unaware of the specific threat, but acutely attuned to the subtle shifts in atmosphere, sensed the change in Elias and Martha. There was a new tension in Elias's jaw, a watchfulness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Martha, though she tried to maintain her usual cheerful demeanor, seemed a little more preoccupied, her smiles occasionally tinged with worry. Lyra didn't ask, her old habit of bracing for the worst without inviting it still deeply ingrained. She simply redoubled her efforts on the ranch, finding a strange comfort in the familiar routines, as if by working harder, by making herself more useful, she could somehow ward off the encroaching darkness. Elias, meanwhile, began to make quiet preparations. He inspected his firearms, ensuring they were clean and well-oiled. He rode the perimeter of his vast property more frequently, his gaze sweeping the horizon for any unfamiliar sign. He spoke in low tones with his most trusted ranch hands, men who had been with him for years, their loyalty as solid as the granite peaks that guarded the valley. He didn't share the specifics of the threat with them, merely instructing them to be more vigilant. He wrestled with whether to tell Lyra. Part of him wanted to shield her, to preserve the fragile peace she had begun to find. Another part, the part that was growing to respect her resilience, knew she had a right to know what might be coming. He remembered her defiance in the saloon, the quiet strength she had shown in the face of abject cruelty. She was no longer just a victim to be protected. She was becoming a part of the broken tea, a part of his life, however undefined that connection still was. One evening, as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, Elias finally broke the silence. Martha had gone inside, leaving them alone in the growing dusk. "The man from the saloon," Elias began, his voice low and steady. "Slane. He's been asking about you in Redemption." Lyra's hand, which had been resting on the porch railing, tightened its grip. She didn't gasp, didn't cry out. She simply turned her head, her dark eyes searching his in the dim light. "He knows I'm here?" "He suspects," Elias corrected. "Men like Slane, they have long memories for perceived slights. And for what they consider their property," the word property hung heavy in the air, a bitter reminder of what she had been. Lyra looked away, her gaze fixed on the distant, darkening hills. "He will come for me," it wasn't a question, but a statement, delivered with a chilling certainty. "He might," Elias conceded. "But this is my land, Lyra. And you are under my protection." There was an unyielding finality in his tone, a promise of absolute defense. "I won't let him take you." Lyra turned back to him, a flicker of something new in her eyes, not just fear, but a nascent resolve, a reflection of his own determination. "I won't be taken," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Not again. In that moment, something shifted between them. The unspoken understanding deepened, evolving into a shared purpose. They were no longer just a rancher and a rescued woman. They were two people facing a common enemy, bound by a shared desire to protect what was becoming precious to them both: her freedom, their sanctuary. And so, dear listener, we see the fragile seeds of hope beginning to sprout, nurtured by kindness and respect. But can such tender beginnings withstand the harsh winds of a cruel world, the resurgence of a past determined to reclaim its due? What do you think? The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension. Lyra, now aware of the looming threat, moved with a new alertness. She learned to handle a small rifle Elias gave her, practicing her aim on tin cans set up by the riverbank. Her hands were steady, her eye surprisingly true. Martha, though her heart ached with worry, showed Lyra how to barricade the doors and windows, just in case. The ranch, once a symbol of peaceful toil, began to feel like a fortress preparing for a siege. Elias rode out one morning, ostensibly to check on a distant herd, but Lyra knew he was scouting, searching for any sign of Slane's approach. He was gone longer than usual, and as dusk began to settle, a knot of anxiety tightened in Lyra's chest. Martha tried to reassure her, but her own unease was palpable. Just as the last light was fading from the sky, Elias returned. He rode into the yard, his face grim. "They're coming," he said, dismounting heavily. "Spotted their camp about 5 miles east. Half a dozen men, looks like. Slane's leading them." The moment they had dreaded was upon them. There would be no more waiting, no more hoping the threat would simply disappear. The shadow had reached their doorstep. Lyra felt a surge of fear, cold and sharp, but beneath it, a surprising current of anger, of defiance. She would not cower. She would not be dragged back into the darkness. She looked at Elias, at Martha, their faces resolute in the fading light. They were her family now, the only family she had, and she would fight for them, for their home, as fiercely as they were prepared to fight for her. The news of Jedediah Slane's imminent arrival cast a grim pall over the Broken T. The idyllic tranquility that Lyra had begun to cherish shattered, replaced by the stark reality of impending conflict. There was no time for lengthy discussions or elaborate strategies. The enemy was almost upon them. Elias, however, was a man forged in the crucible of frontier hardship, accustomed to making swift, decisive choices when survival was at stake. "Martha," he said, his voice a calm command amidst the rising tension. "Secure the house. Bar the shutters. Douse any unnecessary lights. Lyra, stay with her. Use the rifle if you have to, but only if they breach the house." His gaze met Lyra's, and in it, she saw not only concern for her safety but also a grim trust in her ability. He then turned to the 2 ranch hands who bunked near the main house, Tom and young Billy, who had come running at the news. "Tom, Billy, you're with me. We meet them before they reach the yard. We can't let them get close enough to set fire to the buildings." Tom, a grizzled man who had ridden with Elias for a decade, nodded curtly, his hand already resting on the Colt at his hip. Billy, barely a man, looked pale but resolute. Lyra felt a surge of protest. "I can fight," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I can shoot." Elias looked at her, a brief, almost imperceptible softening in his eyes. I know you can, but your first duty is to stay safe. If we fall, you and Martha need to have a chance." His words were stark, a grim acknowledgement of the stakes. There was no room for sentimentality now. Martha, her face set in lines of grim determination, took Lyra's arm. "He's right, child. Come. We have work to do together." They moved through the ranch house, the familiar, comforting space now transforming into a defensible position. They bolted the heavy wooden shutters, plunging the rooms into a heavy gloom, broken only by the thin slivers of moonlight peeking through the cracks. They checked the locks on the doors, placing heavy furniture against them as added barricades. The aroma of baking bread was replaced by the cold scent of fear and the metallic tang of readiness. Lyra clutched the rifle Elias had given her, its wooden stock smooth and cool beneath her trembling hands. She had practiced, yes, but the thought of aiming it at another human being, even one as vile as Slain, sent a chill through her. Yet, the memory of his leering face, the degradation she had suffered, fueled a cold resolve. She would not be a helpless victim again. Outside, Elias, Tom, and Billy moved quickly towards the outer perimeter of the ranch, taking up positions behind a low stone wall that offered some cover, overlooking the main approach to the valley. The moon was high now, casting an eerie, silver glow over the landscape, making shadows dance and play tricks on the eyes. The night was unervingly silent, the usual chorus of crickets and night birds hushed, as if the land itself held its breath. They didn't have to wait long. Dark shapes emerged from the trees at the edge of the valley, riders moving with a furtive, predatory caution. Elias counted 6, just as he'd seen. Slain was at their head, a bulky silhouette in the moonlight. "Hold your fire until they're closer," Elias murmured, his voice barely audible above the thumping of his own heart. "Make every shot count." The riders advanced, oblivious to the reception awaiting them. They clearly expected an easy raid, a quick snatch and grab. Slain likely envisioned Lyra cowering, Elias perhaps caught unawares or easily overcome. He had underestimated the quiet rancher, and he had certainly underestimated the woman he sought to reclaim. When the riders were within 100 yards, Elias raised his rifle. "Now!" His shot rang out, sharp and clear in the night air, followed instantly by the reports from Tom and Billy's rifles. One of Slain's men cried out and tumbled from his horse. Another's horse reared, throwing its rider. Chaos erupted among the attackers. Slain, caught by surprise, bellowed orders, his voice raw with fury. "Spread out. They're dug in. Find cover." The attackers, now dismounted and scrambling for shelter behind rocks and trees, returned fire. Bullets whined past Elias's head, thudding into the stone wall, kicking up dust. The peaceful valley had become a battlefield. Inside the house, Lyra and Martha heard the eruption of gunfire. Martha, despite her age, stood by a window slit, her own ancient shotgun held at the ready. Lyra positioned herself at another, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could see muzzle flashes in the distance, hear the shouts of men, the screams of horses. The fight seemed to rage for an eternity, though it was likely only minutes. Elias, Tom, and Billy fought with disciplined precision, their knowledge of the terrain giving them an advantage. But Slain's men were desperate, driven by greed and the saloon owner's promises of reward. One of the attackers, braver or more foolish than the rest, made a dash towards the ranch house, perhaps hoping to create a diversion or set a fire. He moved in a low crouch, darting from shadow to shadow. Lyra saw him, her breath hitched. He was getting closer, too close. She raised her rifle, her hands shaking. She thought of Elias, of Martha, of the sanctuary they had given her. She thought of the life she was just beginning to reclaim. She steadied her aim, squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The running man stumbled, cried out, and fell, clutching his leg. He didn't get up. Lyra stared, horrified and strangely numb. She had shot a man. Martha, who had seen it all, put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You did what you had to, child. You protected your home." Her voice was firm, without judgment. The The firefight outside seemed to intensify. A stray bullet shattered a window pane in the kitchen, sending shards of glass flying. Then, a cry of pain from near the stone wall. Billy. Tom yelled his name. Elias's rifle cracked twice more. Rapid fire. Then, a sudden, unnerving silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of Slane's wounded man near the house and Billy's groans from the stone wall. The abrupt cessation of gunfire hung heavy and ominous in the moonlit valley. Inside the ranch house, Lyra's ears rang, her senses hyper-alert. She peered through the window slit, her rifle still clutched tightly, searching the shadowed landscape for any sign of movement. Martha, equally tense, listened intently, her shotgun unwavering. Outside, Elias cautiously rose from behind the stone wall. "Tom, you all right?" he called out, his voice low. "Aye, boss," Tom's gruff voice answered. "Billy's hit, though. Leg, I think. Not too bad, but he's bleeding." Elias moved quickly to where Billy lay, his young face pale and contorted in pain. A quick examination confirmed Tom's assessment. A nasty flesh wound in the thigh, bleeding profusely, but likely not life-threatening if tended to quickly. "Slain?" Elias asked, his eyes scanning the darkness where the attackers had taken cover. "They pulled back," Tom grunted, reloading his rifle. "Took their wounded with them, except for the one the girl winged near the house. Think we gave him more than they bargained for." Indeed, the fierce and unexpected resistance had clearly rattled Slane and his hired thugs. They had come expecting to intimidate and overwhelm, not to face determined defenders who knew how to fight. The man Lyra had shot near the house was moaning, trying to drag himself away. Elias approached him cautiously. "It's over," he said, his voice hard. "Tell Slane if he or any of his men ever set foot on my land again, they'll be carried off it in pine boxes." The man, wild-eyed with pain and fear, could only nod frantically. With the immediate threat seemingly neutralized, Elias signaled to Martha and Lyra that it was safe to unbar the door. Martha rushed out with bandages and a bottle of whiskey for antiseptic, her years of practical nursing skills coming to the fore. Lyra followed, her legs feeling unsteady, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away, leaving her shaky and drained. She saw Billy, his face tight with pain as Martha and Tom worked to stanch the bleeding and bind his wound. She saw the fear in the eyes of the man she had shot, now being helped to his feet by Tom, who would escort him a short distance from the ranch and send him packing with Elias's warning. The aftermath of the violence was starkly visible. The churned-up earth, the smell of gunpowder lingering in the air, the blood staining the ground. The cost of defending their sanctuary. Elias walked over to Lyra. He looked at her, his gaze intense. He saw the tremor in her hands, the lingering shock in her eyes. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently taking the rifle from her grasp. "You did well, Lyra," he said, his voice softer now. "You were brave." Her eyes welled up, not with fear this time, but with a complex mix of relief, sorrow, and a strange, fierce pride. I had to," she whispered. "This is my home," he nodded, a rare, almost tender smile touching his lips. "Yes," he said. It is. The simple affirmation resonated deep within her, a declaration of belonging that she had yearned for so long. They worked through the rest of the night, tending to Billy, reinforcing the defenses just in case Slane was foolish enough to attempt a second assault, though Elias doubted he would. The fight had been decisive. By dawn, an exhausted quiet had settled over the broken tea. Billy was resting as comfortably as possible in the main house, Martha fussing over him. Tom was patrolling the perimeter, ever vigilant. The wounded attacker had been sent on his way, a clear message delivered to his cowardly employer. Elias found Lyra sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun rise, painting the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold. The beauty of it was a stark contrast to the ugliness of the night. She looked tired, her face smudged with dirt, but there was a new light in her eyes, a resilience that shone through the weariness. He sat down beside her, not too close, but companionably. They sat in silence for a while, watching the new day unfold. Their valley was peaceful again. "He won't be back," Elias said finally, his voice certain. "Men like Slane are bullies. They prey on the weak. They don't have the stomach for a real fight when the odds aren't stacked in their favor." Lyra nodded, believing him. She felt it too, a sense of finality, of a chapter closed. The past had returned, and it had been met not with submission, but with courage and defiance. And in that confrontation, something profound had been forged. The bond between Elias and Lyra, already growing in the quiet spaces of shared work and unspoken understanding, had been tempered in the crucible of shared danger. They had protected each other, defended their home together. They were no longer just a rancher who had rescued a desperate woman. They were partners in a way that transcended words. As the sun climbed higher, bathing the ranch in its warm glow, Lyra leaned her head back against the porch pillar, a sigh escaping her lips, not of fear or sorrow, but of profound, bone-deep relief. She looked at Elias, his strong, weathered profile outlined against the morning sky. He turned his head and met her gaze. No words were spoken, but a universe of understanding passed between them. A shared look that promised not just safety, but a future. A future together, built on the foundations of courage, respect, and a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. The Broken T Ranch was more than just land and buildings. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a sanctuary earned, a home truly found. The fight was over and they had won. Not just the battle against Slane, but a far greater victory, the triumph of hope over despair, of belonging over alienation. The defeat of Jedediah Slane and his men marked a profound turning point for everyone at the Broken T Ranch. The immediate, palpable threat had been vanquished, leaving in its wake not just relief, but a deeper sense of unity and shared destiny. In the days and weeks that followed, the rhythms of ranch life slowly reasserted themselves, yet everything felt subtly different, imbued with a newfound appreciation for the peace they had fought so hard to protect. Billy's leg healed quickly under Martha's diligent care, his youthful resilience aided by her herbal poultices and hearty broths. He regarded Lyra with a newfound awe, having witnessed her courage firsthand. Tom, ever the stoic, simply nodded his approval more often in her direction. The entire ranch seemed to breathe easier, the shadow of fear lifted. For Lyra, the change was transformative. The terror that had been her constant companion for so long began to recede, replaced by a quiet confidence. She had faced her tormentor, not as a cowering victim, but as a defender of her home and her newfound family. The act of firing the rifle, of actively participating in their defense, had been a reclamation of her own agency. She walked taller, her smiles came more readily, and the haunted look in her eyes began to soften, revealing the intelligent, spirited woman beneath the layers of trauma. Her bond with Martha deepened into one of genuine affection and mutual respect, like that of a mother and daughter. They worked side by side in the kitchen and garden, their conversations flowing easily, filled with shared plans for the coming seasons, preserving fruits, quilting blankets, tending the new batch of chicks. But it was her relationship with Elias that underwent the most profound, albeit quiet, evolution. The shared ordeal had stripped away the last vestiges of formality and reserve between them. They still weren't ones for effusive declarations. Their connection expressed more in shared glances, comfortable silences, and small, considerate actions. Elias would often find wildflowers Lyra had picked placed in a simple vase on the mantelpiece. Lyra would ensure his coffee was always hot when he came in from the cold, his mending done with meticulous care. He started seeking out her opinion on matters concerning the ranch, not just the household. He valued her keen observations, her practical insights. She, in turn, listened intently as he spoke of his dreams for the land, his plans for improving the herds, his deep connection to the valley that had been his family's legacy for generations. One cool autumn evening, as the scent of burning leaves perfumed the air, Elias found Lyra by the riverbank, sketching in a worn journal with a piece of charcoal. He had noticed her quiet artistic talent before, the way she captured the spirit of a horse or the curve of a distant hill with a few deft strokes. He sat beside her, and she showed him her drawings, sketches of the ranch of Martha, even a surprisingly accurate, if slightly idealized, portrait of Elias himself, his stern features softened by a hint of a smile she had coaxed out of him. "You have a gift, Lyra," he said, his voice laced with genuine admiration. She blushed, a rare and becoming sight. "It helps me see the beauty," she whispered. Even when things are hard, he understood. His own solace had always been found in the land, in the tangible work of his hands. Her art was her way of connecting, of healing. Later that week, he presented her with a small, beautifully crafted wooden box filled with proper drawing pencils and smooth paper, which he had sent all the way from a city far to the east. Her gasp of delight, the radiant joy in her eyes, was a reward far greater than any he could have imagined. Their love story wasn't one of grand, passionate gestures, but of a slow, steady unfolding, like a desert flower blooming after a rare rain. It was built on a foundation of shared hardship, mutual respect, and a deep, abiding understanding of each other's souls. They had both known profound loss and loneliness, and in each other, they found not just solace, but a completeness they hadn't thought possible. The proposal, when it came, was as unadorned and heartfelt as the man himself. They were riding together, checking fences along the northern pasture, the vast expanse of the sky arching above them. Elias reined in his horse, turning to face her. "Lyra," he began, his voice a little rougher than usual, "this ranch, it's always felt like a part of me, but it hasn't felt like a true home since before." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "With you here, it feels like home again. More than home." He looked directly into her eyes, his own revealing a depth of emotion he rarely showed. "I'm not a man of fancy words, but I know what's in my heart. I want you by my side, Lyra, always." As my wife, tears welled in Lyra's eyes, tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She had dreamed of such a moment, but had never dared to believe it could be real. "Oh, Elias," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, yes, of course, yes." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, his strong fingers closing around hers. It was a simple gesture, yet it sealed a bond that was already unbreakable, a promise of a shared future, filled with the quiet joys and enduring strength of a love that had truly conquered all. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the main room of the ranch house, witnessed by Martha, Tom, Billy, and a few trusted neighbors. Lyra wore a dress of pale cream linen that Martha had lovingly sewn, a wreath of wildflowers in her hair. Elias, looking uncharacteristically formal in a clean shirt and string tie, couldn't take his eyes off her. As they spoke their vows, their voices clear and true, the room was filled with a palpable sense of joy and rightness. This was not just a marriage. It was the affirmation of a family, a testament to the healing power of love and the enduring promise of second chances. The Broken Tea Ranch, once a place of solitary work and quiet sorrow for Elias, and a symbol of desperate hope for Lyra, had truly become their shared sanctuary, a beacon of light in a world that could often be harsh and unforgiving. Their new life together stretched before them, as vast and promising as the prairie sky. And so Elias Thorne and Lyra, his beloved wife, embarked on their shared journey, their lives intertwined like the strong, resilient vines that climbed the porch of the ranch house they now called home, truly and unequivocally, together. The seasons turned, each one bringing its own challenges and rewards. Summers were filled with the hard work of haying and cattle drives, the sun blazing down on the vast, open range. Autumns brought the bounty of the harvest, the valley painted in hues of gold and crimson, the air crisp and clear. Winters were long and often harsh, the land blanketed in snow, but the ranch house was always filled with warmth, the scent of wood smoke and Martha's hearty cooking, the quiet hum of a contented life. Lyra blossomed in her role as Elias's wife and partner. Her innate intelligence and quiet strength found full expression. She managed the household with grace and efficiency, her artistic touch evident in the simple beauty she brought to their home. But her influence extended far beyond the domestic sphere. She rode beside Elias, her knowledge of herbs and natural remedies often proving invaluable. Her gentle way with animals was legendary, and she had a keen eye for business, often offering insights that helped the Broken Tea prosper. Elias, in turn, found a joy and contentment he had thought lost to him forever. Lyra's love was a gentle rain on the parched landscape of his soul, nurturing growth and healing old wounds. The laughter that had been absent from the ranch for so long now echoed through its rooms. He still wasn't a man of many words, but his smiles were more frequent, the stern lines of his face softened by a deep, abiding happiness. Martha, her heart full, watched them with a grandmotherly pride, knowing she had played a part in bringing these two deserving souls together. The Broken Tea became known throughout the territory not just for its prime cattle, but for its unwavering integrity and the profound kindness of its owners. It was a place where a man down on his luck could find a day's work and a hot meal, where justice was valued above profit, and where dignity was afforded to all, regardless of their station or the color of their skin. Their story, the tale of the silent rancher who had slammed down a gold coin in a dusty saloon and changed a young woman's destiny, became a quiet legend, whispered around campfires and in remote homesteads, a testament to courage, compassion, and the transformative power of love. Years turned into decades. Children came, their laughter filling the ranch house, their small hands learning the rhythms of the land from their father, their hearts nurtured by their mother's gentle wisdom. Elias and Lyra watched their children grow, instilling in them the values of hard work, respect, and empathy that had defined their own lives. Grandchildren followed, their bright eyes reflecting the legacy of love and resilience that had taken root in the fertile soil of the Broken Tea. The ranch expanded, not through ruthless acquisition, but through careful stewardship and fair dealings. It became a beacon of stability and prosperity in the region, a community built on the principles Elias and Lyra cherished. And now, dear friends, we must leap across the vast expanse of time, for the legacy of Elias and Lyra was not one confined to a single lifetime, or even a few generations. The story demands we look further to the 3040th year, and then some since that fateful day in the Redemption Saloon. Imagine, if you will, that same valley. The mountains still stand, ancient sentinels, though their contours may have subtly shifted with the slow breathing of the earth. The river still flows, though its course may have meandered, carving new paths. And in that valley, the spirit of the Broken Tea endures. Perhaps the ranch house itself is no longer there, or perhaps its foundational stones have been incorporated into new structures, built by descendants so far removed they know Elias and Lyra only as revered names from the deep past, figures in the cherished origin story of their enduring community. The land, however, remembers. It remembers the courage of a silent man and a resilient woman. It remembers the principles of justice and compassion that were sown like seeds into its very soil. For over 3 millennia, the descendants of Elias and Lyra, and those who embraced their ethos, have kept the flame alive. Through ages of change, through societal upheavals and technological revolutions beyond anything Elias or Lyra could have conceived, the core values of the Broken Tea, respect for life, the dignity of the individual, the importance of sanctuary, and the strength of chosen family, have persisted. The valley became a legendary place, a haven sought out by those yearning for a just and compassionate way of life. Its people, diverse and thriving, carry within them the echo of Lyra's resilience and Elias's quiet strength. They are known for their wisdom, their fairness, and their unwavering commitment to upholding the legacy of their founders. Scholars from distant lands come to study the enduring compact of the valley, seeking to understand how a small, isolated ranch founded on such simple principles could cast such a long and benevolent shadow across the ages. The story of the woman nearly sold for her skin, and the rancher who saw her true worth, is told and retold, not just as history, but as a living parable, a guide for navigating the complexities of their own time. The gold coin Elias slammed down is now a sacred relic, displayed in a place of honor, a symbol not of wealth, but of decisive action against injustice. Lyra's charcoal sketches, miraculously preserved, are considered priceless treasures, offering a glimpse into the soul of their revered ancestress. And so their story, like the river carving its path through the canyon, flowed on, shaping the land and the lives of countless souls across more than 30 centuries. A testament, wouldn't you agree, to the enduring power of courage, compassion, and a love that dared to defy the darkness and build a legacy of light that time itself could not extinguish? The coin was an investment, not in property, but in humanity, and its dividends have echoed through the ages, a fortune beyond measure.